Camden from the United Kingdom. I've been listening to your podcast for well over a decade now, since I was 16 years old. I have a buy or sell question for you on the better butterfly effect in WWE. CM Punk walking out the night after the Royal Rumble in 2014, leading to Daniel Bryan defeating the Authority and main eventing WrestleMania 30, or Roman Reigns getting COVID before his day one match with Brock Lesnar, leading to their title unification match at WrestleMania 38, and Roman's historic 4-year reign to then lose it to Cody Rhodes at WrestleMania 40 and finish his story. That's a good question. The way I look at this, if Roman never got COVID, he very likely will lose the title that night to Brock Lesnar at day one. And the rumor going around at that time was that Seth Rollins was going to win the WWE Championship from Big E on that show. Now, I could also see Big E retaining and then dropping it at WrestleMania. But in any event, if Roman loses, he would have gotten that belt back from Brock at WrestleMania anyway. And things would have more or less ended up in the same spot, with Roman holding that title hostage for the next 2 years. Now, maybe he wouldn't have had them unified, and he couldn't call himself the undisputed champion, but I think he would have. It may not have happened at WrestleMania, but I do think they wanted Roman to end up with all the gold, and Cody ends up finishing his story the same way. Cody was going to be the guy. He was going to be the babyface to replace Roman when Roman finally lost. They would have found a way to get that WWE Championship on him, because that's the only belt that really mattered to his story, and I think that he would have beaten Roman to do it. Daniel Bryan, on the other hand, despite the groundswell of support that he got in the summer of 2013 and then into 2014, by his own admission in his book, was still only slotted 6th from the top on the preliminary card for WrestleMania 30. He was going to wrestle Sheamus. They probably would have opened the show with it like they did at 28. If Bryan doesn't get the run that he did, he's not as big of a deal as he ended up becoming. You know, the Yes Movement stuff was their best story from that time period, and they had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do it. But if Punk never leaves, he's wrestling Triple H on that show. And Randy Orton is wrestling Batista, as planned. Maybe the anger is still strong enough that they turn it into a triple threat with Bryan, but I'm not so sure about that. So I'm going to buy on Punk walking out, and I'm going to sell on Roman getting COVID, because I think Punk walking out ended up having the bigger effect. William from Calgary. I was watching the 1989 steel cage match between Hulk Hogan and the Big Boss Man, and I don't ever remember seeing Hogan do a top rope suplex before. And it got me thinking that the rings were hard as concrete back then. Do you know how long those rings were hard like that? And when did they get changed? That's a famous spot, and they did that on the house shows too. They worked a lot of house shows on those loops back in 89. And I mean, maybe there were some nights they weren't doing it, but they were doing that probably almost every night. So on those rings too. So think about that. But those rings, they were like concrete. They had no give. Bret Hart and Owen Hart, they did the same spot in their cage match at SummerSlam. Right? Go watch the superplex that Bret gave Owen. There was no bounce. Nothing. The rings that WWE used going back to the WWF days were primarily boxing rings, which are naturally very stiff. And it makes sense when you think about it, because if you're a boxer, you're not taking bumps on the mat, right? You want to have solid footing to maintain your balance. What you don't want to be doing is constantly falling on it and taking bumps, because that's how you end up injured. And that's what wrestlers do. And what happened is that when Vince got on NBC with Saturday Night's Main Event, Dick Ebersol, who, and this is how the story goes, he was the president of NBC Sports. Ebersol wanted rings that didn't seem so bouncy, because when Vince Jr. took over from his dad, it wasn't just the boxing rings, it was kind of a mix of different types of rings, and there was more of a bounce. Ebersol didn't think the bouncy rings looked good on TV. I mean, I'm just assuming he thought maybe it made them look too soft or too phony. So Vince started using some of the stiffest rings anywhere in the business, which are the types of rings that I grew up seeing on TV, you know, the ones that had no give. So because Dick Ebersol didn't like the way the old rings looked, you had a generation of guys destroying their bodies every single night, especially with that ridiculous schedule they kept on the road back then. It wasn't until Vince McMahon started taking bumps in the ring in the late 90s that, I'm sure by mere coincidence, they suddenly switched to the suspension rings that they use now. Because before it was an elevated ring, you had wood underneath, and you had a layer of canvas on top. Now they have springs underneath that they did not have that years ago. Mick Foley said the same thing in his first book. Undertaker has said it. Bruce Pritchard has said it. That, the rings got softer once Vince started bumping in them. And Gary from Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada, the home of Mauro Ranallo and Akam of AOP, which is quite the random pairing. I was listening to another podcast recapping the Raw Bowl from 1996, but they didn't do a great job of it, so I was wondering if you could shed some light on it. I think it's fitting with the start of the football season. Your first problem was listening to another podcast, but that's okay. We all make mistakes. Raw was head-to-head that night with the Orange Bowl, so Vince McMahon decided to host the first ever and last ever Raw Bowl, which was a football-themed four-way match. I think this actually may have been the very first four-way match ever in WWE, at least on television. But it was a 4-team elimination rules match with the Smoking Guns, Owen Hart and Yokozuna, Razor Ramon and Savio Vega, Psycho Sid and the 1-2-3 Kid. They all wrestled wearing uniforms. Earl Hebner was dressed as an NFL referee. They even gave him a whistle. Each team was allowed one timeout. Canvas was green, had hash marks on it to look like a football field. They went all in on the presentation. I mean, if you're going to do something like this, that's the way you do it. I mean, there were so many football puns on commentary with McMahon and Lawler, I lost count. And the Smoking Guns received the Steve Lombardi Trophy for winning the entire thing. I mean, it was cheesy as all hell, but I'll tell you what, I would still take that. I would take the Raw Bowl over a lot of the 3-hour bore fests that we got on that show in 2018 and 2019, which is one of the worst eras in the history of the show. Give me the Raw Bowl